She is sitting at a desk that looks nothing like the desk of someone I spent 12 years not thinking about. She looks up with the calm of a person who has not yet understood what is about to happen to her entire afternoon. Then she understands. Her face does something I will never describe to anyone who was not in this room. I think, of all the last-minute therapy bookings in this city, in this building, on this specific Tuesday in March, I have walked directly into the one room I was least equipped to enter. Dr. W. Castillo looks at me. I look at Dr. W. Castillo. The W stands for Ren. I friend-zoned her in high school. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My name is Lena Voss. I am 29 years old. I booked the therapy session because my sister called me on a Monday night and stayed on the phone for 45 minutes telling me, in the patient and relentless way that only older sisters manage, that I needed to talk to someone. My sister Petra is 34, a family physician in the eastern suburbs, and she has been diagnosing my avoidance patterns since I was approximately 9 years old, and considerably less subtle about them. She is usually right. I have been making it a principle not to tell her she is usually right, because that is the kind of information that encourages a person. The practice she recommended had a same-day cancellation. I said yes before I thought about it. I say yes before I think about it more often than most structural engineers would admit, which is ironic given that my entire professional life is organized around the question of what holds things up and what brings them down. I design buildings that do not collapse. I do not always apply the same methodology to my personal life. The W in Dr. W. Castillo stands for Ren. I did not figure this out until I opened the office door. She was sitting at a desk that was orderly in the specific way of someone who uses orderliness as a framework rather than a habit. Yellow legal pad, a pen, a glass of water with a coaster under it. A small potted plant on the corner of the desk, something dark-leafed and compact that looked like it required very little and gave back more than it took. The bookshelves behind her were the real thing, not decorative. The books were organized by something that was not alphabetical and not genre-based, and which I understood, in the first 3 seconds, to be a personal logic I would have to know her better to map. She looked up. I watched her face understand. It moved through the recognition in stages, each one faster than the last. The professional courtesy of a first appointment. The particular focus that happens when something does not match the intake form. Then something underneath the focus that was not professional and was not courteous and was the specific expression of a person who has been managing an absence for 12 years and has just found the absence standing in their doorway in a gray coat. She said, "Lena." She said it the way she had always said it. 2 syllables. The small pause before and after, the kind of handling that I had spent 12 years telling myself I had imagined, that I had overread, that the parking lot, and the years of silence that followed, had conclusively disproved. My name in her mouth, said in that specific and careful way, doing what it had always done, which was make me feel like I was something she did not want to damage. We did not pretend. She asked if I wanted to reschedule. She said it with the steadiness she had clearly built on purpose over the years, the kind of composure that does not come from an absence of feeling, but from a decision about how to handle feeling in the presence of professional responsibility. I said no. I said it before my judgment caught up. The judgment, when it arrived, noted several reasons why rescheduling would be the sensible course, and then noted that I had driven 40 minutes and paid for parking, and that my sister had been right, and that this room, which was the last room I expected to be in, was somehow the right room, or at least the room I had been delivered to, and that perhaps the difference did not matter as much as what I did next. She said, "Then we should acknowledge the conflict first." She said, "I know you, and you know me, and that is something I am professionally required to name." She said, "I am also willing to hear what brought you in, if you believe you can tell me honestly." I sat down in the chair across from her desk. The chair was good, genuinely comfortable without being the kind of comfortable that makes you feel managed. I sat in it and looked at Ren Castillo, who was 30 years old now, who had been 18 in the parking lot, who was wearing a dark blue linen shirt and dark framed glasses, and had her hair shorter than she had worn it in high school. Still dark, still with the slight natural wave at the ends that meant she had stopped fighting whatever her hair wanted to do sometime in the intervening years. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow from the bicycle incident junior year. The scar was small and slightly silvery, and I had not seen it since October of our senior year, and the seeing of it now was doing something very specific to my chest. I said, "I have not slept through the night in 6 weeks." She wrote something on the legal pad. Her handwriting was the same, precise, slightly leftward tilting, heavier pressure on the downstrokes. I had watched her take notes in every AP class we had together, in study sessions at the library on Saturday afternoons, in the notebook she kept for the debate team that she used to read from aloud sometimes when she was working through an argument and needed to hear it in the air. I had catalogued her handwriting the way I had catalogued everything about her, which was without intention, without a plan, without any coherent explanation for why my brain had decided that this particular archive was worth maintaining indefinitely. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building in the Caldwell district. The district had been industrial 15 years ago and was now the specific kind of neighborhood that happens when expensive and interesting occupy the same space long enough to reach an understanding. There were coffee shops below the practices, and small galleries, and the kind of architecture that suggested someone had thought carefully about the light. The window behind her desk looked out onto a street, and some bare March trees and the pale afternoon sky. The light through the window was honest in the way March light is honest, which is to say flat and a little unsparing, and not interested in being more than it is. She asked about the 6 weeks in careful increments, about the sleep pattern, about what the nights looked like, about whether the poor sleep had begun at a specific moment she could identify. I told her about the bid. I told her about the project, the 4 months of it, the structural approach I had designed around a specific kind of lateral load management that I had believed was genuinely better than the conventional alternative. I told her I had spent 3 months arguing for it internally before the partners agreed to stake the whole proposal on it, and that we had lost to a firm using the conventional approach at a lower price, and that the partners had been gracious and correct, and I had gone home and not slept. She asked whether the loss had felt personal. I said, "It felt like something I staked a version of myself on and lost with." She said, "The version that was right." I looked at her. She said, "You do not appear to be uncertain about whether the approach was correct. You appear to be uncertain about something else." I said, "What else?" She said, "What it means that being right did not protect you." The room was very quiet. I could hear the building around us, the low-frequency hum of a ventilation system, the occasional muffled sound from the practice next door. The building sounded like what it was, which was a place where difficult things were examined quietly, floor by floor, in rooms designed to make the examination feel possible. I said, "That's an accurate reading." She said, "You have been doing this for a long time, staking versions of yourself on things you believe in, and then having to account for the loss." I said, "I'm good at the accounting." She said, "Are you?" I said, "I function. After losses, I function. I adjust, and I learn from them, and I function." She said, "You are not sleeping." I said, "That is the current exception." She said, "Is it an exception?" I looked at the legal pad. She had written something I could not read from this angle. I had always wanted to read what she was writing. From the very first time I had watched her take notes in AP English, had always wondered what she heard when I talked, and how she translated the hearing into marks on a page. I said, "No. It is a pattern." She said, "Tell me about the pattern." I told her, "I am very good at keeping things functional. I identify the correct response to a difficult situation and I implement it. What I am less good at is the period before the identification, the period when the difficult thing is simply present and has not yet resolved into something solvable. I spend a long time in that period. I have always spent a long time in that period. I am fast at solving. I am slow at sitting." She said, "And in the sitting period, what happens?" I said, "I put things in boxes." She looked up from the legal pad. She looked at me in the way she had looked at me, once or twice a year throughout high school, when she suspected I was saying something more true than I had realized. It was a particular look. It was the look she had turned on me in October of sophomore year, when I told her I preferred working alone on everything because teams slowed me down, and she had said, very quietly, that she thought that was a useful story, and also possibly not the complete story. She had been right. I had never told her she had been right. She said, "The boxes. Tell me more about that." I said, "I put the thing I do not know what to do with into a box. I close the box. I place it somewhere I do not have to look at it. And then I function." She said, "What happens to the things in the boxes?" I said, "Nothing. That is the design of the system." She said, "But something is happening now." I said, "Yes. Something is making a significant amount of noise." She said, "How long has the storage unit been maintained?" I looked at her. It was not a question she had asked out of nowhere. She had led me to it so carefully that I had not noticed I was being led, which was the most Ren thing she could have done, which was, build a path so gently that arriving at the end of it felt like your own idea. I said, "About 12 years. The room held that. She held that. She uncapped the pen and then capped it. A small motion, self-contained, her hands doing something quiet while her face did the more difficult work of staying still. I had watched her do this in the car on the way to a debate tournament when she was nervous and was refusing to name it. I had watched her do it in the school library when she was working through a problem and needed her hands occupied while her mind moved. I had cataloged it the way I had cataloged everything, which was compulsively and without permission and with no plan for what to do with the data once I had it. I said, "I think you know what went into the storage unit 12 years ago." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know what went into mine." The ventilation hummed. The March light through the window had gone flatter, tilting toward 4 o'clock, making the room look slightly different than it had at 3:47, slightly more honest, slightly less possible to perform in. I said, "Ren." She said, "I know." I said, "I friend-zoned you." She said, "I remember." I said, "That is the short version. The longer version is that I was 17 years old and I was terrified of what I felt when you looked at me, and I handled the terror the way terrified people handle things, which is to protect themselves very efficiently at the cost of someone else. And the cost in this particular case was yours, and I have been carrying the knowledge of that cost inside a box, inside a storage unit, for 12 years without doing anything honest about it." She was not writing on the legal pad. She was not doing anything, in the professional sense of the word, except holding the space very still, which I recognized as one of the most difficult things a person can do when they are inside the situation I had just described to them. She said, "I need to refer you to a colleague." I said, "Because of the conflict of interest?" She said, "Yes." I said, "That is the professional answer." She said, "It is." I said, "What is the other answer?" A silence. The kind that has weight in it. She looked at the window, and then she looked back at me. And when she looked back, her face was doing something I had not seen it do in the preceding 40 minutes of careful professional management, which was showing me the edges of the thing she was managing. Just the edges, just enough to be honest without crossing the line she had decided to hold. She said, "The other answer is that I have been in this room with you for 40 minutes, working very hard to be only your therapist, and I do not know how to do that for another 10 minutes without saying something that belongs in a different kind of conversation." I said, "Saturday. Coffee. That place on Aldine and 3rd that neither of us has a particular claim on." She blinked. One slow blink, the kind that was not surprise but was the specific adjustment of someone recalculating what they had expected to happen next. She said, "That is a very specific location for an idea you are presenting as spontaneous." I said, "I walked past it this morning. It looked neutral." She said, "My office is 4 blocks from that intersection." I said, "I know. My office is 3. We looked at each other. She said, "Saturday." "Yes." She said it without hesitation. That was the thing. No pause, no visible deliberation, just yes. The speed of a person who had already done the deliberation in advance and had been waiting for the prompt. I stood up. She stood up. We were the same height we had been at 17. She had half an inch on me, or near enough, and the distance between us in that office was 4 feet of soft gray carpet, and 12 years of a storage unit whose contents were currently making a great deal of noise. She had her hands at her sides and I had my bag on my shoulder, and neither of us moved toward the other, and neither of us looked away. I said, "When you said yours made noise, your storage unit." She said, "Yes." I said, "How did you manage it?" She said, "Professionally, imperfectly, with some cost I am not going to describe here." I said, "You're a therapist. You should know better." She said, "Therapists know the boxes exist. That does not make us immune to keeping them." I said, "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" She said, "It is supposed to be accurate." I looked at her one more time. The yellow legal pad, the pen, the scar, the glasses that had not existed 12 years ago and that she wore with the same complete unself-consciousness with which she wore everything else about herself, as though she had taken each element of who she was and examined it and decided whether to keep it and had kept everything she felt was worth keeping. I went to the door. She said, "Lena." I stopped. I did not turn around. She said, "Take the referral seriously. Not because of anything between us. Because you came in here this afternoon and told the truth about something you have not told the truth about in a long time, and that costs something, and it is worth not wasting." I said, "The referral." She said, "Tonight." I said, "And Saturday is different." She said, "Saturday is different." I left. I went down 4 flights of stairs and through the lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and something institutional and out onto the sidewalk in the March air. The city was doing what it always does, which is move without accounting for what has just happened to you. A bus, 2 people, and a dog. A delivery worker on a bicycle navigating the gap between a parked car and a food truck. The sky was exactly as flat and plain and honest as it had looked through her window. My phone had a text from Petra. "How did it go?" I typed, "Complicated." Then I typed, "I think I have to go back." She sent back several question marks and then a single word, "Good." I walked to my car. I sat in it for a while before I started the engine. The referral came at 6:43 that evening. 3 sentences, a colleague's name, a phone number, a clinic address, and then, "She is very good. She will not know your name before she knows your face." I read it 4 times. The 4th time, I stopped trying to read around the last sentence and read directly at it. She had kept my name in whatever room she kept the things she was careful with. She had kept it for 12 years in a storage unit in a city she had chosen that turned out to be 4 blocks from a coffee shop on Aldine and 3rd. She had looked up from her desk on a Tuesday in March and said it with the same inflection it had always had in her mouth, the careful 2 syllables, the pause. All of that, stored. All of that, still intact. I had put her in a box in a parking lot at 17. I had paid the storage fee every month for 12 years by not calling and not writing and building a life in this city without her in it. That was the full accounting. The accounting was not comfortable to sit with, but I sat with it, in the particular way she had identified as difficult for me, without moving toward the solution, without boxing the discomfort, just letting it be present. I booked the appointment with the colleague, same night. Because she had told me not to waste it, and because the way she said things told me she meant them separately from any outcome that might benefit her, which was the kind of honest investment I had not had easy access to in a long time, and which I recognized, even through the noise of 12 years of stored material, as something worth taking seriously. Then I opened my contacts. The entry was still there. I had not deleted it. I had migrated it through 4 different phones without deleting it, which told me something I had been telling myself it did not tell me for a considerable amount of time. The entry said, Ren C., and then the year we had met, which I had added at some point and could not remember adding, which meant I had added it without thinking about it, which meant it was the truest label I could have given it. I texted the number. Saturday at 11, Aldine and 3rd. See you there. The reply came in 40 seconds. It said, I will be there. 40 seconds. No pause for deliberation. No visible calculation. The speed of a person who had done the deliberation years ago and had been maintaining the answer in a storage unit, waiting for the question to finally arrive. I put my phone down on the kitchen counter. I stood in the March evening light that came through the window above the sink, the particular quality of it that made things look like they were on the verge of something rather than in the middle of something, and I tried to identify what I was feeling. There was the relief of having said the true things out loud for the first time in a long time. There was the discomfort of having said them to the person I had been storing them from. There was the specific vertigo of finding out that the storage unit had a corresponding unit on the other side of 12 years of silence, that she had been maintaining it too, that we had been 4 blocks from each other, in a city neither of us had been born in for 6 years without knowing it, and possibly, given the way she had said yes on Saturday in 40 seconds, knowing it. There was something else underneath all of that. Something I had kept so long and so quietly that naming it felt like opening a door I had sealed from the inside. Something that had been making noise for 6 weeks and had been making it quietly for 12 years before that, patient and persistent and not interested in being boxed for any longer than I could make it tolerate. I did not name it that night. I was not ready to name it that night. But I did not put it back. That was the beginning. The week between Tuesday and Saturday moved the way weeks move, when you are aware of what is coming. I went to work. I sat in meetings. I called Petra on Wednesday and told her I had booked the appointment with the colleague, which was true, and said nothing about the coffee, which I was not ready to explain yet. I thought about Ren Castillo approximately every 4 minutes, which was not new. That is the part I had been pretending was not true. I had been thinking about her every 4 minutes for 12 years, which is what happens when you put something in a box and then return to it constantly to verify the seal. The difference now was that I was doing it without pretending I was doing something else. The appointment with Dr. Okonkwo was Thursday afternoon. She had an office 2 floors below Ren's in the same building, which I noticed and said nothing about. She was warm and precise, and had the demeanor of someone who had been at this long enough to stop performing patience and simply become it. She asked what had brought me to therapy now, after what sounded like years of the need being present. I told her about the boxes and the 12 years, not about Ren, not yet. She said, at the end of the session, that the work would require staying in the sitting period longer. I said I was aware. She said awareness was the beginning, not the completion. I booked the following week before I left the building. In the elevator down, I thought about Ren, 4 floors up, writing in that precise handwriting. I thought about what it had cost her to say a great deal of noise in a room where she was working hard to be a professional first. I did not go back up to the 4th floor. I went home. Saturday arrived the way Saturdays arrive when you have spent 4 days thinking about them, quietly and on schedule, without any of the ceremony the anticipation had built up around it. The morning was overcast. The March light was doing the flat, honest thing. I spent longer than usual considering what to wear, which was not something I did in the normal course of events. I settled on what I would have worn on any Saturday, which was jeans and a dark sweater and the good boots, because performing anything other than what I actually was seemed like the wrong note to strike. The coffee shop on Aldine and 3rd was exactly what it had looked like from the outside when I passed it on Tuesday morning. Small, well lit, the smell of good coffee, and something warm and baked coming from somewhere in the back. There were 6 tables, and a counter with stools, and a window ledge with 2 seats that looked out onto the intersection. The person behind the counter had the specific attentiveness of someone who worked in a place they cared about. Ren was already there when I arrived, which was 3 minutes before 11. She was at a table near the window, not the window ledge seats but a table where the light came in from the side rather than straight on, which meant the lighting was good and neither of us would have to squint. She had her hands around a coffee cup. She was wearing a dark green jacket over something lighter, her hair the same as it had been in the office, the glasses, the scar above the left eyebrow. She looked like herself. She looked more like herself than she had looked in the office, without the professional frame around her, without the legal pad and the pen and the requirement to manage anything other than the conversation. She looked up when I came in. She did not do the thing with her face that she had done on Tuesday when she had understood what was happening. She just looked up and looked at me and waited. I ordered coffee. I sat down across from her. She said, "Hello." I said, "Hi." That was the beginning. It sounds thin, but it was not thin. It was the specific weight of two people saying ordinary words to each other across 12 years and 4 blocks and a storage unit each, which is a weight that does not photograph but is nonetheless real. We talked about easy things first, the way you do when the actual subject is large enough to require a runway. The city, which she had come to for graduate school and had not left. The work, which she described in the terms of someone who had found the thing they were built for, the interest in what people do with things they cannot resolve. She said it without looking at me, which I noticed. I said, "That sounds like it comes from experience." She said, "Most of what I find interesting does." I said, "You said yours made a great deal of noise." She said, "It did. It still does, periodically. I am more practiced at sitting with it than I used to be." I said, "Ren." She said, "I know what you're about to ask." I said, "Then answer it." She set down her cup. When she looked at me, her face was doing what it had done in the office, showing me the edges of something larger. Not all of it, the edges. She said, "I have been managing something about you for 12 years. The management has been mostly successful. It has also been loud enough, at times, to require active maintenance. That is not a comfortable admission for someone in my profession." She said, "Some things are more durable than the time you apply to them. That is something I tell my clients. I did not anticipate having personal data to support the point this precisely." I laughed. It came out short and real, and she watched me laugh with the expression of someone who had also found it both true and slightly absurd. She said, "You could have called. In 12 years." I said, "I know." She said, "I also could have called." I said, "I know that too." We sat with it. The coffee shop was warming up around us, Saturday filling in around the edges. I said, "I put you in a box because I was scared. I was 17, and I did not have the vocabulary for what I was feeling, and I eliminated the situation instead of learning the words." She said, "You eliminated it very efficiently." I said, "I know." She said, "I know that about you. I know that you are very good at solving things and less practiced at sitting with them. I know that you stake yourself on the things you believe in, and carry the losses with a weight most people would not. I know your handwriting. I know the specific laugh you just did and the last time I heard it." I stared at her. She said, "I kept a storage unit too. Its contents are not less intact for the time." The coffee shop was warm. The March morning outside was still flat and overcast, which was fine, which was honest. I felt something shifting in my chest. Not the sharp noise of the previous 6 weeks, but something underneath the noise. The thing that had been making the noise, the original material, moving for the first time in a direction that was not deeper into storage. I said, "I am in therapy now." She said, "I know. I referred you." I said, "Dr. Okonkwo said the work requires staying in the sitting period longer." She said, "She is correct." I said, "I am going to be very bad at it." She said, "You were very bad at it on Tuesday, and you sat in my office for 50 minutes and told me several true things. That is a reasonable start." I said, "You told me a true thing too." She said, "I told you several." I said, "The one about the noise." She said, "Yes." I said, "That one cost you something." She looked at me. She said, "Most true things do." I said, "Ren." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not going to put this back in the box." The coffee shop hummed. The intersection moved. The overcast March morning did its honest, unheroic best outside the window, and I sat across from Ren Castillo at a table on Aldine and 3rd, and said the thing I had been not saying for a week or for 12 years, depending on how you measured the duration of a decision. She held it. She held it in the careful way she held things that mattered. She said, "I am not going to ask you to do anything with it right now. We just started. The boxes are open and you are in active therapy, and there is a great deal of work to do before anything should move faster than it needs to." I said, "I know." She said, "But I want you to know that the corresponding box on my side is also open." I said, "The 40 seconds." She said, "Yes." I said, "You answered in 40 seconds on Tuesday." She said, "I had the answer ready." We looked at each other. The table between us was small. The coffee cups were almost empty. The morning was passing the way. Mornings pass when you are paying attention to them, which is faster than you expect and more complete than you planned for. I said, "Coffee again. Next Saturday." She said, "Yes." I said, "And I will not be your client." She said, "No, you will not be my client. You are Dr. Okonkwo's client. I am the person you friend-zoned in high school." I said, "I need you to know that I am going to spend some time accounting for that." She said, "You already started." She said it quietly and without sentimentality, and with the specific directness that had always been her best quality, the quality that meant she would not let you get away with less than the accurate version of a thing. I had loved that quality at 17 without knowing how to name it. I was naming it now, quietly, to myself, in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning in March. I stood up when she did. We put on our coats. She held the door on the way out. We stood on the sidewalk on Aldine and 3rd in the March morning. She said, "Same time next week." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do the work with Okonkwo." I said, "I will." She turned and walked south. I watched her go 3 seconds longer than necessary and then turned north and walked to my car. I texted Petra, "It is going to be complicated and fine, and I will explain eventually." She said, "I will be here." I drove home. The noise in the storage unit had not gone quiet. It was, if anything, more present, because I had opened the door and confirmed that the inventory was intact and had been kept on both sides of 12 years of silence. The difference was that I was not going to close the door again. That was going to require everything Dr. Okonkwo had described, the sitting and the patience and the willingness to be in the discomfort, and the specific additional courage of doing it in front of someone who already knew what was in the box and had been keeping the corresponding records herself, who had looked at me across a table on a Saturday morning in March like I was something she was careful with, who had said the corresponding box is open, the storage unit was open, the noise was present. I was, for the first time in 12 years, not maintaining the seal. That was the beginning. The second Saturday, she brought 2 coffees to the table before I arrived. I walked in at 2 minutes to 11, and she was already there, with both cups placed on the table, the one on my side still steaming, and she looked up when I came in and said nothing about the coffees. She did not explain that she had ordered mine without asking because she remembered how I took it, which was information from 12 years ago that she had apparently also kept in the corresponding storage unit. She just said, "Good morning." I sat down and put my hands around the cup and it was exactly right, and neither of us mentioned it. That was the second Saturday. By the 4th Saturday we had established a pattern. 11 o'clock, the table near the window, coffees she arrived early enough to order. I had stopped being surprised by the fact that she remembered. I had started paying attention instead to what else she remembered, which turned out to be an inventory sufficiently large and specific to constitute its own structural argument about what 12 years of silence can and cannot accomplish. She remembered the name of the debate coach, who had told her junior year that her delivery was technically excellent and emotionally absent. She remembered what I had said about it at the time, which was that he was wrong about the second part. She said, "I thought about that for years afterward. Every time I had to deliver a verdict or a difficult assessment, and I was trying to decide how much of myself to put into the room, I kept the thought that someone who paid attention believed the emotion was there." I said, "It was there. It was very clearly there. He was watching the surface." She said, "I know that now." I said, "Did it help?" Keeping the thought. She looked at the window, then back at me. She said, "Yes. More than I would have expected something to help, for something I was supposed to have put behind me." I held that for a moment. I said, "I told you it was the worst decision I ever made." She said, "You told me that on Tuesday. The first Tuesday." I said, "I have not changed my position." She was quiet. She said, "I did not handle it gracefully." After the parking lot. I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "I said okay. And then I moved colleges and did not contact you, and spent several years working very hard to develop the version of myself that was not holding what the parking lot had cost." I said, "Did it work?" She said, "I am a licensed therapist. I am not without resources." I said. That's not what I asked. She looked at me. The glasses, the scar, the way she held things she did not want to drop. She said, "No, not entirely. Some things are more durable than the tools you apply to them." The coffee shop was doing its Saturday business around us. There was a child at the window ledge, drawing in a notebook, pressing hard on the crayon the way children press, completely committed to what they are making. There was a couple at the far table who were not talking to each other but who were talking to each other in the way people who have been together long enough to have a whole language in their silences talk. Perfectly. I noticed these things because I was in the specific state of someone paying attention to everything, as a way of managing what they are feeling, which is a state I recognized from Dr. Okonkwo's description of my operating mode and was, at least, now aware of. I said, "I have been thinking about the parking lot." She said. "Yes," I said. I knew what I was doing when I said it. "I want you to know that." I was not oblivious to what was happening. I knew what you felt, and I knew what I felt, and I chose the version of it that I could manage, which was the version where I named it something safe. She said, "I know." I said, "That's worse, isn't it, than if I had been oblivious?" She said, "Yes and no. Being deliberate is worse in the sense that you had the information and chose what to do with it. It is also better in the sense that you were aware. People who are not aware cannot account for their choices. You can." I said, "Is that therapy?" She said, "Technically, yes." I said, "It also happens to be true." She said, "That is the goal." By the 6th Saturday, I had started dreaming about her, which was not new information exactly, but was new in the sense that I was now paying attention to it, rather than storing it. The dreams were not elaborate. They were the kind of dreams you have about people who have become structural to how you think, the kind where they are simply present in a room while you are doing something else, and their presence changes the quality of the room. I told Dr. Okonkwo about the dreams. She wrote something on her notepad and asked how the dreams made me feel when I woke up. I said, like I had been somewhere very honest and had to come back. She said, "That is useful information." I said, "About the dreams?" She said, "About what you are looking for." I thought about that for the next 4 days. On Thursday of that week, I was working late on a revised structural proposal, the kind of late that turns into 9 o'clock before you realize you skipped dinner, when my phone lit up with a text from the number in my contacts under Ren C. And the year we had met? The text said, "Are you in your office? The light is on." I looked at the window. From my desk on the 3rd floor I could see the street. She was on the sidewalk in a dark coat, not looking up at the window, looking at her phone. I texted back, "Yes, you walk home this way?" She said, "Sometimes. Is that strange?" I said, "No." I said, "Come up." There was a pause. Then, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." She came up. I buzzed her in, and she appeared in the doorway of my office 3 minutes later, in the dark coat, with her glasses slightly steamed from the outside air, and her hair slightly disordered from what I could only assume was the wind that had been doing unpleasant things to the city all day. She stood in the doorway and looked at the structural drawings spread across my desk, and the cold coffee on the corner of the desk, and me in the state of someone who had been at work for 12 hours and was not at their most composed. She said, "I walked past and saw the light and thought I would check." I said, "You walked past to check on me." She said, "I walked past because this is a reasonable route between my office and my apartment. The checking was incidental." I said, "That is a very specific definition of incidental." She looked at the drawings. She said, "Can I see?" I turned the main drawing toward her. She looked at it for a long moment, the specific, focused way she looked at things she was genuinely interested in, not politely, completely. She asked 2 questions about the lateral load management that told me she had paid attention to what I had said about the lost bid and had done enough independent thinking about it to know which questions to ask. I told her. She listened. She said, "That is a genuinely better approach. The fact that they chose cheaper does not mean you were wrong." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" I looked at her. I said, "I do. Most of the time." She said, "The nights when you don't?" I said, "Yes." She said, That is what the storage unit is for. The nights when the knowing is harder. I looked at the drawings and then at her. In my office, in the 9 o'clock light, without the coffee shop table between us, and without the professional frame around her, and without 12 years of careful distance, she looked very much like the person she had always been, and also like someone I had not been permitted to look at directly for a very long time. I had been looking at her sideways for 6 Saturdays, which was a survival technique I was beginning to find insufficient. I said, "Ren." She said, "Yes." I said, "This is the part where I tell you something I have been sitting with for 6 Saturdays. She did not move. She was very still in the way she went, still when something was approaching that she had been waiting for. I said, "I am not putting it back in the box. I told you that on the first Saturday, and I meant it. But I want to tell you specifically what is in it. What I have been keeping." She said, "You do not have to do this tonight." I said, "I know. I want to." She looked at me. Then she moved to the chair across my desk and sat in it and put her hands on her knees and gave me her full attention in the specific way she gave her full attention to things, which was everything else leaving the room. I said, "I was in love with you in high school, not as a phase and not as something I grew out of, because I have had 12 years to determine whether I grew out of it, and the answer is that I did not. I handled it badly in the parking lot, and I handled it badly for 12 years after that, by maintaining the silence as though it had been a mutual decision, which it was not. Those are the contents of the box." She was quiet. She was quiet for long enough that I heard the building settle around us the way buildings settle at 9 o'clock on a Thursday in March, the specific sounds of a space that has been full of people all day emptying toward its own structure. She said, "Lena." I said, "I know. You do not have to answer tonight. I wanted you to know what was in it." She said, "No." I looked at her. She said, "No, I mean, I am going to answer. I have an answer. I have had it for 12 years, and I have been deciding since the first Tuesday whether to give it to you now or later, and I am going to give it to you now, because I am tired of the later being where things go." I said, "Ren." She said, "I was in love with you too." That is the answer. Not was only, but also am, which is the uncomfortable precision that I am going to give you anyway because you just gave me precision, and it would be cowardly to respond with anything less. The drawings were spread across my desk between us, and the city was doing its 9 o'clock things outside the window, and the office had the particular smell of a space that has held someone's focused work for many hours, paper and coffee, and the slight warmth of electronics that have been running all day. I said, "You said, am." She said, "Yes." I said, "Not past tense." She said, "I was very clear about the tense." I said, "I am going to need you to say that again at some point when I am not processing 12 years of boxes in real time." She said, "I will say it as many times as you need. That is not a thing I am in any danger of running out of." I looked at her. She looked at me. The office was very small or very large. I could not determine which. The way rooms get when the important thing has finally been said in them, and everything needs a moment to reorganize around the fact of it. I said, "What do we do now?" She said, "Now you go home and eat something because you skipped dinner. And we go to the coffee shop on Saturday. And we do the work we are both in the middle of doing, because we both have boxes that are open, and neither of us is done with the sitting yet." I said, "And after the sitting?" She said, "After the sitting?" "Yes." She stood up. I stood up. We were in the small office with the drawings and the cold coffee and the city doing its honest late evening things outside the window, and she was 4 feet away, and I had just said the thing I had been storing for 12 years, and she had said the same thing back with the precision of a person who had been keeping it ready. She said, "Go home, Lena." I said, "Okay." She went to the door. In the doorway she turned around. She said, "The approach was better. Just so we are clear, you were right about the lateral load management, and they chose cheaper, and that is not an indictment of being right." I said, "You walked past on purpose?" She said, "I walked past on this route for the first time in 6 years. So, not on purpose, and also not accidental. Both things can be true." She left. I stood in my office for a long time. Then I put on my coat and turned off the light and went home and ate something, and did not sleep, but the not sleeping had a different quality than it had on the 6 weeks of Tuesday night before the first appointment. It felt like being awake for a reason rather than being awake because something was wrong. There is a difference. I had not known there was a difference until that night. I texted Dr. Okonkwo in the morning. I told the truth about the boxes last night. Full inventory. She had the corresponding contents. Dr. Okonkwo responded. How do you feel? I said. Like I am in the sitting period for real now, not managing it. Actually in it. She said. Good. I will see you Thursday. The Saturdays continued. The 8 o'clock texts started, which were not therapy and were not coffee and were not the careful, deliberate format of the Aldine and Third Table. They were Ren sending me a photograph of a construction crane doing something unexpected against the morning sky because she had walked past it and thought of me. They were me sending her a description of a structural problem I was working through because describing it out loud helped me think, and I had apparently decided that her mind was the one I wanted to think out loud at. They were the slow accumulation of a person into your daily life that happens when you stop managing the accumulation and let it occur. I called my sister on a Sunday in April and told her the whole thing. About the practice with the same-day cancellation. About the office. About the 12 years. About the parking lot. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Lena. I said, I know. She said, you have been in the same city. I said, 4 blocks. She said, 4 blocks for 6 years. I said, yes. She said, this is the most structurally engineered thing you have ever done. You built a load-bearing wall around the most important thing and called it a storage unit. I said, that is an accurate structural metaphor. She said, how is she? I said, very good at her job and extremely patient with me, and also apparently in possession of the same level of intact material that I have been maintaining, which is either a sign that we are both very good at keeping things, or that the thing itself was genuinely durable. Petra said, both things can be true. I said, she said that, those exact words. Petra said, I like her already. The day in May that changed the pattern was a Wednesday, which was not a day we had assigned significance to. I had come from a site visit in the East Corridor and was walking back to the office along a route that took me past the Caldwell district without design, or without full design, or with the kind of design that looks from the outside like something other than what it is. I texted her, are you in the building? She said, between clients. 5 minutes. I said, I'll be on the steps. The steps of the building on the Caldwell side were concrete and faced west, which meant, in May, they caught the afternoon light in a way that made them considerably better than they had any right to be. I sat on the top step. She came out 6 minutes later, in the dark blue linen she had been wearing the first Tuesday, which she had apparently not retired on my account, and she sat beside me on the step and looked at the street, and said nothing for a moment. She said, you came this way on purpose. I said, I came this way because the site visit was in the East Corridor. She said, the East Corridor is not on this route. I said, technically. She said, Lena. I said, yes. We sat on the steps for the 5 minutes she had between clients. She talked about the week. I talked about the site. The May afternoon did its particular thing, which was be warm in a way that felt like a promise had been kept after a long stretch of something that hadn't been. She had her coat on her arm and her glasses, and the Scar and I had been sitting with the open storage unit for 2 months, and Dr. Okonkwo had said on Thursday that she thought I had done considerable work in a short time, and that the pace was mine to set. I was ready to set a different pace. She said, I have to go back in. I said, I know. She stood. I stood. We were on the steps in the May afternoon, and she was 4 feet from me, and then 3, and then she said, with the quiet precision she brought to everything that mattered, Lena, and I said, yes, and she put her hand on my jaw the way you put your hand on a thing you have been careful with for a very long time, and are finally touching on purpose. It was brief. We were on the steps of a building in a neighborhood that was not without pedestrians. She put her hand on my jaw and I held very still the way she went, still when important things arrived, and she looked at me for one moment with the full attention she brought to things she found genuinely worth understanding. Then she said, "Saturday." I said, "Saturday." She went back inside. I stood on the steps in the May afternoon for longer than was practical. The street moved around me. I felt the place where her hand had been. Warm skin. Exact. The touch of someone who does not do things without reason, and had done this one on purpose, on the steps of her building in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon. I walked back to the office. I could not have told you what route I took. Saturday arrived. It was the 12th Saturday. We had been doing this for 3 months. 3 months of coffees at 11 o'clock and 8 o'clock texts, and the Thursday evening and the April phone call with Petra and the May steps, and everything that had accumulated between the first Tuesday and now. I had not slept through the night in 6 weeks when I walked into her office, and now I was sleeping. I was doing the work with Dr. Okonkwo. The boxes were open, and I was learning to sit in the sitting period, which was not comfortable but was real, which turned out to be more important than comfortable. I arrived at 11. She was already there. 2 coffees, the table near the window. I sat down. She looked at me in the way she looked at me now, which was no longer the way you look at something you are managing from a professional distance. She looked at me the way you look at something you have been careful with and have decided to stop being only careful with. I said, "I want to tell you something." She said, "All right." I said, "I have been in the sitting period for 3 months. That is longer than I have ever stayed in it without moving directly to the solution. I want you to know that." She said, "I know." I said, "Dr. Okonkwo says I have done considerable work." She said, "She told me." "Not the specifics." "She mentioned your pace." I said, "You speak to Dr. Okonkwo?" She said, "We are in the same practice. We have a shared consultation structure. Nothing you're specific to your sessions." She said, "Your pace." I said, "What did she say about it?" She said, "That it was yours to set." I looked at her. I said, "I am setting it now." She was very still. I said, "I want to do this properly. I want to take the time it takes and not rush the sitting, and not box anything that needs to be out of the box. And I also want to stop sitting on opposite sides of the coffee table from you at 11 o'clock on Saturdays and pretending that is what this is." She said, "It is what this has been." I said, "It has been the beginning." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want the rest of it." She held her coffee cup in both hands. The coffee shop was doing what it did on Saturday mornings, warm and unhurried, the intersection outside moving without caring what was happening at our table. The overcast March light of the first Saturday had been replaced by May light, which was something else entirely. Which was what happens when you give things the time they need and something changes. She said, "I want to tell you something back." I said, "Okay." She said, "I made a mistake in the parking lot too, not the same mistake as yours. Mine was that I accepted okay as the complete story and moved to another city, instead of telling you what okay had actually cost me. I did that because I was also scared, which is relevant information I withheld for 12 years. I said, "Why are you telling me now?" She said, "Because you told me it was the worst decision you ever made, and I told you the am instead of the was, and I want you to have the full picture before the rest of it, because the rest of it deserves a complete accounting, and not just a partial one." I said, "You were scared." She said, "Extremely." I said, "Of what?" She said, "Of the same thing you were scared of. Of what it meant. Of what I felt and what it said about me. Of the specific quality of being seen by you, which was and is unlike being seen by other people, and which at 17 I did not know what to do with any better than you did." I looked at her, the Ren Castillo who had been 18 in a parking lot and had said okay and had moved to another city with a storage unit that made a great deal of noise. The Ren Castillo, who was 30 years old in a coffee shop in May, saying, "Extremely scared, and the full picture, and because you deserve it." I said, "We were both scared." She said, "Yes. We were both 17 and scared and we handled it badly together, not just you and not just me. I want you to have that clearly." I said, "Thank you." She said, You are welcome. I said, can I tell you what I want to do about it? She said, yes. I said, I want to have dinner with you, on a day that is not Saturday at 11. I want to go somewhere that is not the coffee shop on Aldine and 3rd, which I will always be grateful for, but which has had 12 Saturdays of being neutral territory, and I would like to go somewhere that does not have to be neutral. She looked at me. She said, when? I said, tonight. She said, it is Saturday morning. I said, I know. She said, yes. I said, yes? She said, yes, tonight, not neutral. I will pick the place. I said, you will pick the place? She said, I have been thinking about the appropriate venue for this specific dinner since approximately the second Saturday. I laughed. She watched me laugh and did the thing she did when I laughed, which was, look at me like the laugh was something she had been keeping track of and was glad to have confirmed. I said, that is more planning than I expected. She said, you should know by now that I am thorough. The dinner she had been planning since the second Saturday was at a restaurant in the Caldwell district 8 blocks from the coffee shop, a small Italian place with exposed brick and candles and the specific feeling of a room that had been designed to be good for important conversations. We went at 7. She was already there, which I had come to accept as her default, and she was in something that was not the dark blue linen and not the professional uniform, and which told me she had also thought carefully about what to wear, the same way I had. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about everything we had not talked about in 12 years, and some things we had talked about, and the difference between how they had sounded then and how they sounded now. We talked about her doctoral program and the specific thesis she had written, and the year she had almost left the program before a conversation with her advisor had clarified something essential. We talked about the projects I had designed and which ones I was proudest of and why. We talked about her family, a subject she had been careful with in the coffee shop and was less careful with tonight, giving me pieces that I understood were not given easily and that I held carefully. She said, at some point between the pasta and the thing that came after the pasta, what do you think the parking lot would have looked like? If we had been braver. I said, different, better, longer. She said, longer. I said, we would have had more time. She looked at me across the table with the candle doing something warm to the light between us. She said, we have time now. I said, yes. She said, it is not the same 12 years. I know that. I said, no, but it is the time we have. She said, I want to use it well. I said, I know. I can tell. She said, how can you tell? I said, the restaurant. The second Saturday. The 40 seconds. She looked at the candle, then at me. She said, the 40 seconds. I said, you already had the answer. You had been keeping it ready. She said, for a long time. I said, I know. She said, that is the part that is supposed to be uncomfortable. The length of the keeping. I said, it is not uncomfortable. It is the most honest thing you have told me. She held that. I watched her hold it, the careful stillness, the thing she did with weight she did not want to drop. Outside the restaurant, the May evening was doing what May evenings do in cities when the year has finally finished being winter, which was be warm and long and unhurried, and full of people who were also glad to be outside in it. The candle on our table was doing the thing candles do, which is make everything inside the radius of their light look slightly more true. She said, I have wanted to tell you something since the parking lot. I have had various versions of it at various points in the 12 years. This is the version I want to say now. I said, say it. She said, I am glad you walked through the wrong door. I said, it was the right door. She said, you did not know it was the right door. I said, no, but here we are. She said, here we are. The candle, the brick, the 3 hours and the 12 years, and the parking lot and the 40 seconds and the corresponding box. Here we are. I reached across the table. I put my hand over hers, which was resting on the table between us. She looked at my hand on hers and then she looked at me, and she did not move her hand away. She said, Lena. I said, I know. She said, we are going to do this carefully. I said, I know, she said. Not because I want to do it carefully for its own sake. I said, because we both have boxes that are still being unpacked. She said, yes. I said, and because carefully means we do not lose any of it. She said, yes. I said, I am very good at load-bearing structures. She looked at me for a moment. Then she did the thing she did when something landed truer than expected, the almost smile, the slight adjustment in her face that was not performance but genuine. She said, I know that about you. We walked out of the restaurant into the May evening. The city was doing its warm late spring Saturday thing, people on the sidewalks, and the smell of the season in the air and the particular quality of city light at 9 o'clock in May, which is something different from every other time and season. She had her coat over her arm. I walked beside her on the sidewalk, not a precise distance from her, just beside her, the way you walk beside someone when you have stopped managing the distance. We walked 4 blocks before she stopped. We were in front of a building that was not my building and not her building, and was not particularly notable except that it had a small garden in front of it, with something that had started blooming recently, white flowers on a low hedge, the specific smell of something new. She turned to face me. She said, I have been thinking about this moment since the second Saturday also. I said, the moment where we stop walking. She said, yes. I said, what did you plan for this one? She said, nothing. I planned everything before this and nothing after. I looked at her. The May evening light, the white flowers, the glasses, the scar above the left eyebrow from the bicycle incident junior year when I had stayed on the phone with her for 3 hours. All of it. The whole inventory. Open, present, not in a box. I put my hand on her jaw the way she had put her hand on mine on the steps in Wednesday afternoon. Warm skin. The way someone touches a thing they have been careful with and have decided to stop being only careful with. She put her hand on mine, over it, holding it there. Her eyes closed for 1 second and then opened. She said, yes. I kissed her. It was not urgent. It was the opposite of urgent. It was the specific quality of something that has been kept carefully for a long time and is finally being handled in the open, patient, deliberate, fully present. Her hand on mine, the May evening. The white flowers doing their quiet, unremarkable blooming in the garden of a building neither of us had a claim on. When we stopped, she looked at me. She said, that was not the worst decision you ever made. I laughed. The laugh was real and immediate, and she held it in the way she held things she had been cataloging. I said, no, definitely not. She said, go home. Sleep. I said, you have a lot of instructions for someone who is not my therapist. She said, habit. I said, Saturday. She said, Saturday. And also, not only Saturday. I said, yes. I walked home in the May evening through streets that looked exactly the same as they had looked on any other evening, and which were completely different because I was a person who had opened a storage unit and done the sitting and had said the true things out loud, and had been told the same true things back with precision, and who had just kissed Ren Castillo in front of a building with white flowers in the garden, in a city 4 blocks from her office and 3 blocks from mine. I slept through the night. For the first time in 10 weeks, I slept through the night. The next morning I texted Dr. Okonkwo. I think I am making progress, she said. I know. I said, is that a therapeutic assessment or do you talk to Ren in the halls? She said, both things can be true. I thought about Ren saying those same words in the coffee shop on a Saturday in April. I thought about the parallel inventories, the corresponding boxes, the 2 storage units maintained at a distance of 4 blocks for 6 years without comparison. I thought about the parking lot at 17, and the first Tuesday in March, and the 40 seconds, and the answer that had been kept ready. I thought about all of it for a long time. Then I texted Ren. Good morning. She said, good morning. How did you sleep? I said, through the night. There was a pause. She said, I know. I said, you cannot possibly know that. She said, I know it because you just told me, and also because I did too. For the first time in a while, I held that for a moment. 2 people who had been maintaining storage units in a city 4 blocks apart, sleeping through the same night for the first time in a while, telling each other in the morning. I said, coffee on Aldine? She said, I will be there at 11, I said. I know. She was.